And here with me to discuss all of this is Sahil Kapoor, national political reporter for Bloomberg Politics. Also Bernard Whitman, former pollster to President Clinton, and Don Hayworth, former Republican congressman from New York. All of you, thank you for your time as we continue this here. Sahil, I want to start with you. When you have the president's response and you say somebody like Gordon saying that there's got to be a much more humble approach, what's your take on how the president responded?
It's an interesting response by President Trump. It's somewhat more traditional than we've expected from him, someone who was a very non-traditional presidential candidate and who's proven himself non-traditional in the way he communicates, kind of fires off whatever comes to his mind. He's not done that this time. His response, at least so far, to North Korea's provocation here has been sort of what you might expect from previous presidents. He has gotten together with his allies. He sent his defense secretary to Seoul and to Tokyo, saying the international community will respond very, very strongly and effectively. He was standing with Prime Minister Abe of Japan together once this happened, and they both gave sort of a joint statement together saying, we stand together, we're going to fight back against this. So I think he is thinking through this. I think he's decided not to make any sudden or brash responses, at least as president. And that's I think a remarkable thing. That's a notable thing given what people had feared the most from President Trump.
Yeah, and that's what we're watching when it comes to White House responses. Interesting the take that we got earlier on Meet the Press. And turning to Michael Flynn's future, here's what the presidential advisor Stephen Miller said earlier today on Meet the Press to Chuck Todd. Let's listen.
Well, the White House did not give you anything to say other than that.
They did not give me anything to say. It's not for me to tell you what's in the president's mind. That's a question for the president. It's a question for our chief of staff.
If you were caught misleading the vice president of the United States, would that be considered a fireable offense in the Trump White House?
It's not for me to answer hypotheticals. It wouldn't be responsible. It's a sensitive matter.
Bernard, so sensitive matter. Hypotheticals not in his place to answer that. And you know, the White House didn't give me anything to say is pretty much his response. What is your take on that as far as leaving it at that?
Well, my take is it's representative of the entire first 3 weeks of the Trump administration, which has been an unmitigated disaster on all fronts. Foreign policy, not accepted. I mean, let's go down the list. First, he completely ticked off our Muslim allies who we need in the fight against ISIS and al-Qaeda with his attempted travel ban. He embarrassed us with our allies by trying to bar refugees to this country. He stood there with Prime Minister Abe and refused and forgot to criticize North Korea, actually calling out the reason for saying, I stand with the Prime Minister 100%. He has a national security chief who either lied about talking to the Russian ambassador about sanctions or has a short-term memory loss. He completely has done an about-face on the Iran deal. He walked back bold statements about Israel, and he hung up on one of our closest allies in the Asia-Pacific region, Australia. So this is altogether not a good start.
You want to jump in? I want to hear it. You're looking at you right now. It looks like you do.
Well, Bernard, you're bringing up, you're perpetuating certain aspects of the kind of, fake news that's become so hard to fight against in the first 3 weeks of this administration. But the fact of the matter is that vulnerability to Russia and to its advances was clearly made the case by the Obama administration. They were the ones who failed to respond forcefully when Russia invaded Crimea. They were the ones who allowed 20% of our uranium supply to come under Russian control. What the president has said is that he will be, and what he has demonstrated through his cabinet selections, is that he will be knowledgeable, that he will be forceful, that he is not going to allow the United States to be compromised by anyone.
But let's talk about actually what happened in the call with Putin. He fundamentally undermined, President Trump fundamentally undermined the cornerstone of nuclear arms reductions with that country by criticizing the START deal and then not even really knowing exactly what it was. So he's misinformed and misaligned with all our allies. It is really an astounding.
I think it's important.
Go ahead.
I think President Trump certainly has given countries around the world and leaders around the world a lot to be concerned about. There's no doubt about that, and I think a lot of the criticisms we heard were valid so far as they go. But I think it's also worth remembering that on two other big tests he's faced, on Iran and on on Israel. He's fallen back into at least somewhat more traditional patterns on Israel. He was saying throughout the campaign a pretty emphatic support for Israel to do whatever it wants with regard to its neighbors. He pulled a 180 and said he doesn't want Israel to build new settlements or expand existing ones. He said it would could be damaging to the peace process. Also on the Iran deal, he's continued to say it was a terrible deal and so forth, but he's not committed to ripping it up. I think he understands on some level that you can't just reimpose those sanctions and unwind the clock. So I think he may not have fully grasped the complexities of all these things, but I think now that they're staring him in the face, he is thinking about them.
Well, let's talk about that, especially we have this meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu on Wednesday, when we have what's been described as very different in their public relationship and now their private, personal relationship as well, especially given the relationships that Benjamin Netanyahu had with President Obama. What can we expect when it comes to those meetings on Wednesday?
Well, the relationship with President Obama was strained at best. Right. I mean, President Obama, unfortunately, whatever he might have said to Netanyahu in private, clearly the actions that he pursued were not indicated that there wasn't strong support and friendship for Israel in the way that President Trump, I think, will supply. But President Trump is also a realist and a pragmatist. And in fact, Benjamin Netanyahu himself supports a Palestinian state, has continued to support a solution that will accommodate a Palestinian state. The question is, how do you do that? And I think the president was wise to say that in terms of the settlements on the West Bank, it's reasonable for Israel not to be provocative while we're trying to work out an agreement. And I have a feeling he's going to discuss that, frankly, with Netanyahu on Wednesday.
When it comes to that walk back, when it comes to the walk back and settlements and knowing it ahead of this meeting that they're going to be having on Wednesday, Bernard, what is it that you're saying that can be taken away?
I mean, personally, I'm glad that he's calling Israel out, because settlements are not the answer to a two-state solution. But what concerns me is he sold Americans a bill of goods saying one thing and is doing a complete about-face when it comes to actually following through on a number of his campaign pledges. What does that say about this country, that we can elect someone who will sort of be so inflammatory and full of braggadocio, and then he gets into office and does a complete about-face?
So, Hale, I want to ask you also, besides the president and the prime minister, too, we'll be watching Jared Kushner. He'll reportedly have that main presence throughout Netanyahu's visit. So what will we see as far as Jared Kushner asserting his influence there in the West Wing, and what more are you expecting from that?
Well, there have been reports that Jared Kushner and Prime Minister Netanyahu have a pretty close relationship that dates back some years. Kushner is obviously a very influential advisor to President Trump, but I think at the very least we'll see President Trump exhibit a much warmer personal relationship with Netanyahu. I think the main problem with President Obama and Netanyahu was not so much that the two countries weren't working together, that the United States had somehow abandoned Israel, but those two had a very bad personal relationship. Something just didn't work there, and I think President Trump, in the way that many presidents conduct their foreign policy as a response to the previous administration, President Trump will look at that and say he would want a at least much better PR and much better optics in terms of the United States and Israel's relationship.
And the whole attitude toward Iran. I mean, that was a fundamental problem, obviously, in the relationship between the U.S. and Israel
Trump hasn't
under
changed
the
that.
Obama administration. And that needs to be fixed.
All right, I want to ask you about this. I want to end it with this. You have Senator Chuck Grassley. I want to ask you about it. I don't know if you read his tweets recently this afternoon. They're kind of coming fast and furious here, starting with all of his tweets with whoever monitors Twitter at the White House and then adding messages for the president. Apparently not the first time Grassley has used this method to get attention from the White House here. So what are your thoughts on this? Bad sign. Look at this. I mean, whoever monitors, what do you have against election opponents because they're killed in prison, poisoned, and they're, what do you think about that?
I'm glad that the Republicans in Congress are finally standing up for the American people and, frankly, standing up for their party. For some reason, Donald Trump was allowed to hijack the Republican Party and have become the party of Putin. I mean, this is absolutely outrageous that he says more nice things about Putin than he does about our allies like Australia, more nice things about Putin than he says about previous presidents. And I think it really shows that the Republicans are realizing, with a president who has an approval rating of 40%, he's underwater by 15 points, 55 disapprove, 40 approve. Trump is in a weak political position, and the Republicans are ready to take him on.
I think it's remarkable. Could I just say it's remarkable that the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee has to communicate with the White House and the president through tweets. Especially if it's a member of the same party as the president. That's very unusual. Okay. That only happens when there's a disagreement.
Is it unusual though? Is it unusual given this administration, knowing that, as we've talked about and reported on before, about policy being?
It's historically unusual. It's historically unusual. Okay. It hasn't happened with previous presidents, but it does show that Chuck Grassley, Senator Grassley, has some strong views about these things, and all of his concerns, at least some of them, are not being heard by the White House.
And he's following the president's lead and going to Twitter to express some of those things and inspire a response.
And we will keep these Twitter accounts in our feeds monitoring, because as we've just seen, it certainly is not going to be the end of those 140 characters that we'll see. To all of you, my panel, Sahil Kapoor, Bernard Whitman, and Nan Hayworth, thank you for being with me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Up next, Mexicans.